Welcome to Penn Arts and Sciences' 6th annual Penn Grad Talks, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name's Beth Wenger, and I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Studies for the School of Arts and Sciences. Today is the first day of a 4-day series of talks, and we're going to start with graduate students in the humanities. In the School of Arts and Sciences, we value the humanities because they help us understand others through their languages, their histories, their cultures. They reveal how people have tried to make sense of the world through the ages. The humanities teach empathy, and they foster social justice and equality. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. First will be Pauline Carbonnel from French and Francophone Studies, followed by Kimberly St. Julian Varnon from the History Department, and then 3 students, Xinyun Wang, Ran Yan, and Chongqing Zhao, all from East Asian languages and civilizations. I encourage you to watch each of the 5 talks and click on the link below to cast your own vote for the Audience Choice Award. We'll select one winner across the 4 categories for that $500 prize. We hope to see you back tomorrow for the social sciences presentations. The full schedule and voting information can be found at sas.upenn.edu. And finally, let me thank all of our presenters for sharing their wonderful work with us and for demonstrating the critical role that our graduate students in the humanities play in Penn Arts and Sciences. Enjoy the talks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. Thanks also to the organizers who made this event possible. I would like to start with an anecdote. A few years ago, for a Halloween party, everyone had to dress up as their biggest fear. Well, I dressed up as a deadline. I borrowed all of my friends' watches that I stacked along my arm. I had this giant countdown t-shirt. I was also wearing shorts as a nod to always being short on time. Everyone probably thought that the costume was just about every grad student's worst fear. And I can't deny the fact that I myself do dread academic deadlines. But what they couldn't see was the other deadline, the ultimate deadline, the one that bears a sense of impending doom that we all share in the 21st century. The ecological deadline that has been imposed on the Earth. Even if we finally seem to acknowledge the irreversible harm being done to the planet and share the same sense of urgency, the truth is that we are past the deadline. As many have remarked, including French philosopher Bruno Latour, we can no longer claim to be living in the era of an ecological crisis. Latour opens up this very book by an observation that I'm sure everyone in this room will relate to, an observation about how our daily existence is saturated with reminders about climate change. It doesn't stop, he writes. Every morning, it begins all over again. One day, it's rising water levels, the next, it's soil erosion. By evening, it's the glaciers melting faster and faster. On the 8 p.m. news, we learn that thousands of species are about to disappear, etc. In my research, I do not seek to determine when it all started and when it stopped qualifying as a crisis. Instead, I'm interested in how, in the 19th century, the word limit started to mean something that was ecological. To do that, I situate my research at a nexus between science and literature. I look at the way 19th century scientific discoveries may have led to a dawning consciousness about a countdown regarding the Earth and its resources. For example, thermodynamics predicted that the sun would run out of energy and cause what is called the heat death of the universe. In my dissertation, I studied the way these new anxieties permeated fiction, in particular science fiction. So far, I've only talked about time limits. but I also study limits in space, geographical limits. The 19th century, perhaps more than any other century, was obsessed with the idea of finishing what had been started but never completed, mapping out the entire globe so that there were no more blank spaces. As a result, the 19th century really became the golden age of polar exploration, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, with dozens of expeditions trying to determine what was at the far ends of the Earth. And I'm always fascinated by the journal logs from such expeditions that I find buried in the archives. And I'm not the only one. The popular imagination back then was really fond of rescue missions following the mysterious disappearance of ships like that of the Franklin expedition. John Franklin, not, Ben. The ends of the Earth that I study are geographical, geological, and ecological. What I want to show you today is how one French novelist, sometimes called the father of science fiction, had the same idea. His name was Jules Verne. You might know him from novels such as 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea or Around the World in 80 Days. His whole project was characterized by an overlapping of scientific, spatial, and temporal quests. As his editor wrote, Verne's aim is to sum up all the geographic, geological, physical, and astronomical knowledge accumulated by modern science, and hence to rewrite in the attractive and picturesque form, which is his specialty, the history of the universe. Rereading his novels at the end of the Earth, I realized that really going to the last limits of the globe for him was haunted by elements that are so familiar to us and have become a part of our climate crisis. This is a map from one of Verne's novels in the Arctic, in which the goal of the expedition is to reach the North Pole. What strikes me in this novel is the manic obsession of the captain to keep thrusting forward, to keep pushing the limits, while at the same time, the novel is haunted by the depletion of resources like coal and even food for the surviving crew members. Verne also explores the South Pole in a novel called An Antarctic Mystery. It's a novel that really straddles the line between different sorts of limits, between texts, between fiction and reality, and that gives the boundary between the known and the unknown a mystical dimension. All this in a way that is very much anchored in an ever-changing landscape. As a side note, if you're wondering why there is water, a sound splitting the pole in two, it's because back then some scientists argued that there was a warm sea at the South Pole. That said, Verne was fascinated by all sorts of geographical ends of the Earth, not just the poles. In my dissertation, I follow his itinerary to spatial boundaries of all sorts. For example, I look at the center of the Earth as a limit, unless this time the limit is not on a horizontal plane, but a vertical one. The particularity of going to the center of the Earth is that the deeper you go in terms of depth, the farther you go back in terms of time, back to the very birth of the planet, millions of years ago, and the geological traces that it left, thus shattering the comforting idea of a young planet controlled by humanity. I also look beyond the limits of the atmosphere, and of course, back in the 19th century, space was still the real unexplored margin. So I look at how science fiction grappled with this type of scaling up and adopted the global, planetary scale of concern that resonates with 20th century thinking about the planet's fragility. So, what's the point of looking at science fiction at the most remote strips of the known world? One of my guiding interrogations is the extent to which literature can be a means of thinking about finitude, And if it is, why and how it is the genre of science fiction that may have managed to bring concerns of an endangered planet into view by infusing the notion of limit with a new meaning that may have precluded our own anxieties about ecological limitedness, about the fact that there is an ecological countdown. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. You're going to judge me, and that's okay. One of my favorite writers is Stephen King. And in his book series about the Dark Tower, he says, there are other worlds than this. And this is what I'm talking about today. When we think about African Americans in Soviet Central Asia, Soviet Uzbekistan, most people are like, Black people, Russia, the Soviet Union, what? But yes, there are African Americans in the Soviet Central Asia, in the Soviet space in the 1920s and 1930s. Two worlds. One is Jim Crow. One is African Americans are legally segregated from their white counterparts. It's lynching, it's racial terror, and it's the Klan terrorizing African Americans throughout the American South. Sharecropping has distorted economic benefits. African Americans work dozens of hours a day for pennies. The flip side, the Soviet Union, the Druzhba Narodov, the friendship of the peoples. People across the world see the Soviet Union as this really interesting place or this really terrifying place. Either you think the 5-year plan under Stalin's really fascinating, it's fast, super cultural change, economic change, or it's the greatest communist threat to the world. Both, maybe, maybe not. I leave that up to you. But what the Soviet Union represented to many African Americans was an escape from racism, from racial terror that impacted your soul, your body, the souls and bodies of your children. What does a future look like if it ends at the end of a rope on a tree? So when we think about African Americans who go to the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s, we have to erase our ideas of what it meant to be a communist in the 20s and 30s, to really understand why they would go to this place, that while it's having economic development, also has a massive famine that will kill millions of Ukrainians and Kazakhs. So my research operates on a really dangerous premise now. I'm gonna say something that might get me arrested. Critical race theory, I said it. So here is my argument. Race is not biologically real, but phenotypic difference is. Another element of this, while race is not biologically real, it does have social and cultural significance, particularly in the United States in the 1920s and 30s. So this is our running assumption for this presentation. What I argue is that through the experiences of African Americans in Soviet Central Asia, we can understand the fluidity and contextual nature of race. What does this mean? How does this happen? Who cares? African Americans like Langston Hughes, one of the most famous African American and American writers, journalist Homer Smith, African American communist activist Louise Thompson Patterson, they all went to the Soviet Union in search of something different, another world, a world free of racism, a world free of racial terror, a world that gave a different look at what the world could be without capitalism. Here are the two main factors that kind of join together African Americans and Soviet Central Asians, particularly residents of Soviet Uzbekistan. One, as you can see from this picture, cotton. The tactile idea of cotton. Cotton conjoins Soviet Uzbekistan and the American South. But what Langston Hughes pointed out, it was very strange and surreal to see people just as brown as he was picking cotton for themselves. There was no overseer. There was no white landowner who would take their money from them. What does it mean to pick cotton for the Soviet Socialist Uzbek Republic versus what it means to pick cotton in Alabama? Langston Hughes points out all the children in Soviet Uzbekistan were in school. They were not in the fields. And he remembers how in Mississippi, when it's time to pick cotton, African American children are not in school. They're in the fields, being robbed of their future to produce for American capitalism. Another element we see in this picture, besides cotton, is this idea of a shared oppression. Journalist Homer Smith was good at this. I call him the scribe of Black Russia. He's a journalist who left the United States shortly after the Scottsboro trial because he knew, as a Black man in his early 20s, the United States was dangerous. So he finds himself in the Soviet Union, and he writes for African-American newspapers, and he writes headlines like this: Black shepherds of the Omar Khayyam land. He describes Uzbeks as swarthy people. He calls them the blacks of the Russian Empire. Why is this important? Because beyond shared phenotypic similarity, our skin color, beyond the tactile similarity of picking cotton, we have this idea of a history of shared oppression. And this is why the Black press is important. Because writers like Homer Smith, Loren Miller, they're writing to a public in America, a Black reading public that understands racial oppression, that understands economic oppression. And this is the history he creates. And this isn't out of thin air. Throughout the Russian imperial period, Uzbeks were treated as different. They were often segregated from their Slavic-looking counterparts. They had to pick cotton, but saw no benefits from it. So when Homer Smith is writing to African Americans in Alabama and Mississippi in 1932, they fundamentally understand when he says that during the Tsarist period, the Uzbeks were Jim Crowed. Everyone in the United States who was Black knew what that meant. Another fascinating person is Louise Thompson Patterson. Unfortunately, throughout Soviet history, and particularly African-American experiences in Soviet history, Black women are often left to the wayside. There's not much in the archives about them. But this woman, without her, there is no African-American trip to the Soviet Union to create an anti-racist film called Black and White. The film is canceled, we aren't quite sure why. Probably Stalin. It's usually Stalin. But she organized this trip. She got the funding together. And she went to Soviet Uzbekistan and she met and spoke to Uzbek women who had recently unveiled, who had left abusive husbands, who finally had access to education. Women who were, in many ways, for the 1930s, liberated. And this Black woman thought about Black women in the United States who had no right to an education, who had no right to vote, who couldn't lead integrated social and political groups. But she saw that in Soviet Uzbekistan, and she wanted that in the United States. And it fundamentally shaped her activism when she returned to the United States. So what about these lives? Why do these Black lives matter? Because they show us race and the American understanding of race is not the only way it functions. Throughout history, particularly in the Soviet Union, when it presented itself as racially neutral, African Americans saw alternatives to both capitalism and racism in the United States. So I remind you that there are very much, in fact, other worlds than this. Thank you.
Hi guys, today I will be discuss about, or more likely to introduce to you guys about the secret society in mainland China, the people who are involved in the cooperative marriage. So just like someone who are in the closet regarding their sexuality, people are in the cooperative marriage are facing the same kind of problem. But before we dive in, I'd like to show you guys some news first. 7 months ago, The Guardian posted news about the shutdown of LGBTQ accounts on WeChat, and similarly, China bans the depiction of gay people on all kinds of other media. So WeChat, sharing as one of the biggest social media platforms in China, has long been a safe place for the LGBTQ community to represent and communicate with each other. However, as I highlight here, some of the accounts that have been operating for years are being demonetized and censored without even further notice. This kind of news might sound surprising to many in the year of 2022, however, it's nothing new. As early as 2017, Weibo, the Twitter of China, has been going on wars with Chinese netizens regarding posting about LGBTQ content. Even though homosexuality has been decriminalized in China in the late 90s and removed from mental illness disorder list in the early 2000s. However, the stigma against the homosexual individuals still exists. So after going through a little bit hostility background toward homosexual individuals in mainland China, I like to proceed with the rest of content here. First being the norm of marriage in China, its traditions and the values, and how it prompts to the formation of a cooperative marriage. And then I would define closet cooperative marriage, following by 2 case studies to actually clarify and materialize how a cooperative marriage could carry out. And lastly, I want to talk about why this topic matters and some of my afterthoughts. So the norm of marriage in China is deeply rooted in Confucianism idea of filial piety. In a way that I quote here, there are 3 things which are unfilial, and to have no posterity is the greatest of them. So we see a reinforcement on the heterosexual nature of marriage, where producing an offspring comes as the most important thing after marriage, and Chinese parents love to pitch the idea of being properly matched to their kids when they are planning on a marriage. 门当户对, in literal translation, it means 2 families who are in the marriage together have to be socially and financially compatible, or as I put it, it has to be look good on paper. So the romance is not the center focus of a marriage anymore, and marriage itself serves more like a responsibility owed to the society and the parents. And from here on, we see a high parental involvement in the Chinese marriage. This is a picture taken in Shanghai marriage market, where the parents are literally laying down the information and pictures of their children on the ground like commodities, and other parents are just strolling around to find a potential date for their children. So like I said before, marriage in China are more like marriage between families rather than 2 individuals. So to define closet marriage, actually Ang Lee has already touched on this subject in his movie The Wedding Banquet, where this Taiwanese guy was in love with his American partner. However, he married a girl from Shanghai who was only in the marriage for green card. They faked a heterosexual marriage just to make the Taiwanese guy's parents happy. Well, in reality, corporate marriage has less to do with financial gains, but more about LGBTQ community and individuals finding their partner in crime and come back together against the stress from society and both from the parents. And people usually find their partner in crime through matchmaking websites and apps. And these websites and apps for corporate marriage are also taking extra measures just to dodge the Chinese online police. And users of these websites are usually gay singleton who is trying to find a lesbian singleton and fake a heterosexual marriage together. Sometimes it also can be the case where a gay couple finding a lesbian couple and faking 2 weddings together, almost like one stone, 2 birds situation. And they can make at least 8 parents happy at the same time. So during the course of marriage, they will usually sign a prenup or even buy a house together to co-live, and they will live under certain protocols and rehearse how to greet parents. So it's almost like a marriage of method acting. And some may ask, is this kind of marriage even possible to carry out? So here are 2 case studies. One being Chunjiang, I call it happy ending. So Chunjiang actually came out to his parents during high school, and he and his boyfriend were both got physically abused pretty bad and thrown on the street. So he decided this kind of disappointment and stress was not worth it. And he stayed single for 10 years until his parents are stressed him about the importance of a heterosexual marriage again. So he met his wife on the Discord under the subject of corporate marriage, where his wife right now was also a lesbian and had similar experience as him. And now they got married together, faked the wedding, and they're co-living like siblings, where he literally called his wife big sister at house. And they have like a separate romance life and no longer dealing with the constant nagging from their parents anymore. However, corporate marriage don't usually always end up happily. The bitter ending from an anonymous lesbian netizen shared on Discord, where when she and her girlfriend, about 10 years, trying to find a gay couple to get married to, it fell off because her girlfriend fell in love with one of the gay guys for real. And as we all know, sexuality can just be a spectrum. Sometimes people's feelings change, and what left are just 2 broken hearts. So a lot of unforeseen complications can take place too, and corporate marriage don't really work out at all time. So why I want to talk about this topic, first, this topic is very underexplored. When I was searching online, no serious journals or articles are written on this topic. And secondly, I want to raise awareness on the hostility situation the LGBTQ community are facing in China. As you guys can see, while typing LGBTQ or corporate marriage thing like on Chinese social media, it literally informed me it is against the law to show me the results of this research. And lastly, some people say corporate marriage is a helpless compromise, but for me, I really don't think so. I think it is a courage. It is the preservation of originality of the LGBTQ community in mainland China. They are doing the best within the measures they can, and I really respect that. So my afterthoughts on will this kind of situation get better? For now, I really don't have an answer if everything will go through or proceed through a positive way in mainland China. But when we look at some neighbor country like Taiwan, where it literally legalized gay marriage, and in Japan, they have massive media presentations and the support for the LGBTQ community and other marginalized group. So hopefully, these countries can influence China a little bit in the future. And for now, corporate marriage still stay as the best in the war situation. So thank you, guys.
Hello, I'm Ran. Thank you to invite me here. Let's start by looking at the juxtaposition. On the left is a Buddhist-Japanese painting genre kusozu, painting of the 9 stages of a decaying corpse, whose surviving instance dates from 13th to 19th century. The female corpse not only represents the world's transiency, but also enables the viewers, mostly male monk, to resist their lust for beauty. On the right is a portrait of Philippe Burty, a 19th century French art critic. He is widely accepted as the inventor of Japonisme due to his serialized article entitled Japonisme. In this article, he introduced the Japanese culture, art, and language history, although now Japonisme often indicates a 19th to 20th art style in which Western painter imitates Japanese art. Today, I'll explore and contextualize Burty's encounter with kusozu since no later than 1871 in Paris, when the uncommon painting about death and corpse found its counterpart in the warfare. One is the siege of Franco-Prussian War, another one is Paris Commune, a civil war that led to tens of thousands of deaths inside the Paris. Furthermore, I review the strategies of telling the painting story as the first sign and hallmark of Burty's Japonism article in 72 and 75. In this process, we'll see how a Japanese painting was endowed with new context and meaning in French society. Despite that, the painting itself now is missing and mostly only traceable through Burty's textualization. To begin with, let's start from Burty's first article of Japonisme, published on May 1872, in which Burty described a painting owned by himself. The various phases of the cadaveric decomposition are accomplished, succeeding each other with a frightening regularity. Even though Burty himself had no idea of the genre of this painting, I find out its identity through comparing Burty's description with the canonized 9 stages of kusozu, which include, for example, the new diseased, the consumption by birds and animals, the tumulus, and so on. In Burty's 1872 article, several points worth noting. First, the corpse is alive before complete decomposition. The flower blooms more brightly when the corpse is in the drastic reaction of decomposition, and only wither when all flesh has been given back to the active elements, to the very beast, when the corpse is no longer able to sustain the form of a human. Therefore, the flower represents an abnormal post-mortal vitality, shown by the drastic decaying process of the corpse. In this way, the corpse only died after the flower died. Secondly, Burty showed a subtle sympathy on the corpse through describing a man who piously collects the bones of the female corpse. The man is ambiguous enough for the reader to imagine whoever they would like. This point will become clear if we consider the abruptly common deaths during the 70 and 71 in Paris. During the siege, that French soldier was sent back to small cemeteries in City Wall, and some of them located within 35 minutes of walking distance of Burty's home. However, it's during the Commune, especially during the Bloody Week on May 21 and 28, that were not uncommon to find a pile of bodies 6 feet high behind abandoned barricades, that the corps of National Guard, the members of Commune, were insulted, venerated, or sketched by citizens. Even after the Bloody Week, the corps of National Guard continued to swell and rot under the heat of early summer, especially those improperly buried in public space, such as in squares, church, or convent gardens. The clearing up of them continued until at least September. Burty, an enthusiastic collector of ruins, also a friend of some National Guards, likely to respond to events mentioned above. Therefore, I suggest that Burty show his sympathy to National Guard through the alive corpse and pious bone collector. Furthermore, his article could strike a responsive chord in the heart of his reader. However, in the 1875 article, Burty restaged the female corpse as the ugly mass, whose post-mortal vitality totally disappeared. Burty writes, "The yellow flowers have disappeared, suffocated, when the ugly mass has become marbled with bloody stains." Furthermore, the pious man of 72 is exposed to a strategical simplification, since in fact, the man is a young Buddhist priest, whose appearance this time is carefully depicted by Burty's text and illustration, the only copy from Burty's original Kusotsu painting. In consequence, Burty invites his reader to align themselves with the pious man in 72, while reject this self-projection in 75 and distance his reader from the decaying things. Why? It's worth noting that for Burty, the objective of restaging the female corpse in 75 is to renew his Japonisme as a scholarly field, also to reiterate his ownership of inventing Japonisme. All the intention were manifested by his next article on the Academy. Not only that, as society came back to its normal track, horrible memories become profitless for the survivor's social practice. To get rid of the unbearable past, people turn to look forward to the future. Burty's new Japonisme catered to this active forgetfulness, a prevalent public mood in post-commune French society, and built Burty's reputation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chongqing. I'm going to talk about the biggest institution in the world and the most influential one, the internet, in my presentation. I won't celebrate the country as an idol, how fandom culture shaped Chinese cyberfeminists. And I believe the combination of China, internet, and feminists will be really exciting. So let's move on. Before diving into the major incident in 2020, I'd like to give you some background information about Chinese cyberfeminists at this stage. There, I summarized 2 major obstacles and 2 strategies utilized and faced by Chinese cyberfeminists. The first one is facing heavy criticism from other netizens. And there are 2 major resources for such criticism. The first one is, of course, from the opponents in the general discourse of patriarchy. As you know, and maybe introduced before earlier in another speaker's presentation, the Confucian traditions and the culture and the social conditions in contemporary China is still heavily influenced by the patriarchal system, and hence such criticism on feminist pursuits and Chinese feminists is still heavy. And the second one can be from the national sphere, because some feminist pursuits are really against institutional agendas. For example, the 3-child policy, the mandatory 1 month divorce cooling off period, and a half-year maternity leave. These 3 policies were all passed in 2021 in mainland China. And these policies are meant to encourage more women to go back to their families, give birth to more children, and really hampered those women from being in their professional careers. And the second major obstacle is the strict censorship on social media platforms. The major battlefield has always been social media platforms, and in China, the Weibo, as said, the Twitter, the Chinese version of Twitter, Douban, and maybe other platforms such as WeChat. Since the strict censorship was due to the code of positive energy, which was to encourage more display and illustration of positive contents in terms of propaganda of the Chinese government and the mainstream policies of the CCP. And there's a monumental incident in 2018, that is the hashtag of #MeToo, which was transported from United States to China at the end of 2017 and early 2018, was banned on Weibo. The whole hashtag, which has been viewed, commented, posted, and reposted for over 1 million times, was officially banned and removed from Weibo. And multiple KOLs accounts were silenced and deleted. In this case, there are 2 major strategies for Chinese cyberfeminists. The first one is to occupy cyberspace with feminist discussions. This is not like simply posting and propagandizing feminist agendas on Chinese internet, but their online activism has always been evolving through time to time from one incident to another. And especially the one I'm going to talk about later has really demonstrated they're maybe the newest and the most influential strategy at this point. And the second one is to disconstructing the patriarchal agenda of building good women. The most practical and significant agenda for Chinese feminists at this point is to delete or to disconstruct the agenda of good women, which was confirmed by the patriarchal system. Although the liberation of women was written in Chinese Communist Party's code and doctrines from really early times in 1930s, but social and cultural sphere has always been really critical. And these are some examples of the strict censorship. The black one is from WeChat instant communication application, and the one at the bottom is from Douban, and this one is from Weibo. And you say this account is called the Voice of Feminists. And when it was removed and banned, it already had 18,000 followers, but it was still silenced. In 2019 and 20, 2 major incidents marked fandom culture's impact on online activism. In the middle of 2019, the incident of anti-extradition law amendment bill movement in Hong Kong and its following response from Chinese netizens in mainland China made great impacts and demonstrated how Chinese netizens' passion for patriotism and fandom nationalism. This movement was not really new. As you see, these 2 screenshots, because like most posts are still going on in Instagram, Twitter, and maybe Weibo, and these are some examples. You can see the first one is called 中央粉丝后援会. That's a fandom organization for the CCP or the Central Power. And it's totally organized by Chinese netizens voluntarily. And in the comment section, this is a certain style which will really mark the fandom nationalism in 2019 and still at this point is the combination of compliments for China, its big scale of grant and how much achievement China has achieved, and some general codes like 八荣八耻, the 8 goods and 8 misconducts by Xi Jinping and popular among Chinese people. In this is really not a new invention because in 2016, the Diba expedition made huge impacts in both online and offline world of China. In the book, From Cyber Nationalism to Fandom Nationalism, the case of Diba expedition in China, edited by Hailong Liu, Professor Guobin Yang's chapter introduced the major methodology of posting memes or 表情包 in Chinese under Tsai Ing-wen's Facebook account when the Taiwan issues turned into political turmoil online. In this 2019 version of online activism and this incident, the emphasis of Central Power in China and CCP grew more explicit and emphasized. And as you can see, there is an idolization, humanization, and a celebration of a female figure as a national representative. And the name of motherland has already been changed to the Azhong Gege, or like the Chinese brother. And in 2020, the CCP officially launched 2 virtual idols who are national representatives, Jiang Shanjiao and Hong Qiman. The female one is Jiang Shanjiao and the male one is Hong Qiman. In the debuting video, Jiang Shanjiao was introduced as the elder sister and equipped with slim body parts, sweet voices, and adorable personalities. CCP and designers were expecting massive celebration from fandoms, but they only accepted really heavy criticism, especially from Chinese cyber feminists. And this Weibo post was already removed, but by the time it was removed, it has already been reposted and commented more than 30,000 times. And in this comment section, people are posting about realistic obstacles for Chinese women and posting questions like, Jiang Shanjiao, are you called a slut because you're so close with Hong Qiman? Or Jiang Shanjiao, are you going to give birth to a child? And Jiang Shanjiao, can you be as good as the boys when you enter high school? And these are realistic concerns for Chinese women, but it was reconciled and ignored or avoided in the official propaganda. For my conclusion is that after this incident in 2020, Chinese cyber feminists developed their awareness of anti-patriarchal narrative that is based in the national propaganda, which means that the feminist voice is always pursued, is always avoided in the official narrative, and the Chinese cyber feminists realized their obstacle was not only from their opponents, but from the institutional sphere. Another thing is that the fandom culture contributed to this strategy of propagandizing feminist agenda on Chinese internet. It's the way they spread their messages and propaganda, their agendas, not only by posting their realistic incidents, but by questioning the system and posting questions massively. And that's it. Thank you.